Hi everyone. This presentation is about the Common Core State Standards, and the purpose is to give you some of the background of how they were developed and what I want you to think about as you are aligning your therapy with these standards, which is a requirement for many of you and for SLPs across the nation. If your state hasn't adopted the Common Core State Standards, I bet if you look at your state standards, you'll see some similarities, and you will also be required to use the standards for aligning your therapy practice. So what is the history? Well, in 1989, which is a long time ago, but not really when you think about it, the National Governors Association and the federal government got together and they said, you know, we really need to create some standards in each state, educational standards, because before that there weren't state level standards. So states did adopt standards with federal support, and then we saw with No Child Left Behind in 2001 that there was further emphasis on these standards and using standards to create curriculum and how teachers taught and all of that, and to really add some accountability of educators for student success. Now the issue with No Child Left Behind, as I'm sure some of you understand, is that the state test that was used for accountability purposes didn't align well typically with the state level standards. And that's a problem because we really value what we assess. And if so much is tied to these state level assessments, guess what happens? Teachers and school districts, etc., are going to start to teach to the test, and that's what we saw. So we were missing that alignment. So what were some of the other issues that led to the development of the Common Core State Standards? Well, a huge one was the fact that there were disparate standards across states. So, for example, I did my schooling in Florida, and I don't feel that I got the best education, but if you go to another state such as California even, the level of rigor could look very different from state to state. So that was a problem, especially with the second bullet point, increasing student mobility, because students would cross state lines and you'd be like, okay, well, they're supposed to be in third grade, but how come they don't have this, and this skill or knowledge or strategy that my second graders have? And so teachers would get students that were coming in from different states, and there was no telling really where they were at. They could have met expectations in one state, but could be, below average in another. And that's a problem. We also see a lot more global competition. So for us to prepare our students to be competitive in the workforce nowadays, they need different sets of skills than they needed just 10 years ago even. And so that goes along with that fourth bullet there. And we know from the NAEP data, which other countries take and all this, that our students are not college or career ready. When they graduate 12th grade, they are not ready to start college. A lot of the students have to take remedial courses where they are not getting college credit for them. And that's a real problem. You would think if you graduate with a high school diploma, it needs to mean something. We also know from more recent data that employers are not satisfied with the students' abilities and skills and knowledge that they're leaving high school with. It's just not enough to get them a job and for them to be successful in that job. And the last point here, it's really a civil rights issue, because getting a good education shouldn't be determined simply by where you live. And so we saw so much disparity across the states and even communities within states that I believe a national set of standards was required to fix some of that. So I'd like you to think for a minute about your own educational experience. So when you were going in school, if you moved a lot, how did that impact you? Did you feel like school was hard? Was it too easy? Did you feel like you really had the skills you needed when you started your undergraduate degree? And then also think about students that you work with now and students coming in from out of state. Do you work with high school students? Do you feel like a bulk of them are ready for what the demands of college or the workplace look like? So how did this development come into place? Well, this again was a partnership of the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. So the big point here that we see a lot of misinformation about is this was a state-led effort. It wasn't a federal mandate. The Common Core state standards were not created on a federal mandate, but they were funded by the Gates Foundation. The federal government stepped in afterwards to help promote the adoption of these standards and provide money for the development of tests. So different states could get Race to the Top funding if they adopted the Common Core state standards. And so they incentivized it, which I don't actually have a problem with. So 45 states, the District of Columbia, and 4 territories had adopted the Common Core state standards. Some other states had partially adopted the standards, so maybe they adopted the reading set or the math group. We're still, so right now we have English language arts, we have math, they're working on science now. So this changes though, because the Common Core has become very politicized, and so state-level leaders have seen some pushback from their communities about this idea that this was coming from the federal government, which is actually not true. But you can look at this website, and if you just look up Common Core State Standards, Google it, you'll get to the main website, and there is such great information on there. So please take a minute to look at that. So what's going on in Colorado? Because I know a lot of you are in Colorado, and this is similar to what happened in other states too. So in 2010, the Colorado Department of Ed began a gap analysis, and so they wanted to see how well the Colorado academic standards aligned with the Common Core. And they found that there was 95% alignment. So that helped them say, okay, we're going to adopt the Common Core. But guess what? Because Colorado likes to do things their own way, they are not calling it the Common Core State Standards. They're calling it the Colorado Academic Standards. But if you look at them, it's all the same stuff, plus. So Colorado has preschool standards, whereas Common Core does not. And you might see them organized a bit differently, but the guts are the same. So as these standards were being developed, they had a set of criteria that they used in development. And so they wanted these standards to be research and evidence-based. They wanted to focus on the things that really made a difference for kids. They talked to colleges, they talked to employers, they wanted to find out what they were seeing and how to bridge that gap. And I mean, as a college instructor and someone who teaches undergrads, the disparity across my sophomores and juniors is so great in terms of their ability to read difficult text and their ability to write. I have seen such huge differences among students in the past 5-6 years. So the standards are rigorous, but if we jump down a little bit, they are clearly focused. So that means we're not just taking a whole bunch of standards and saying, okay, Virginia has these, let's merge them with Massachusetts, and then we'll have this group of standards. No, so there are a good amount of standards, but they are focused. And they also looked at what successful countries outside of the United States were doing and looked at how our standards compare to theirs. And finally, the standards just provide the goal for teachers. They don't teach or tell teachers how to teach the standards. It doesn't come with a curriculum. So it leaves a lot for teacher judgment, which I think is very important. Now, saying that, guess what? All the publishers and everybody has jumped on this bandwagon, of course, and so that they are creating materials that are aligned with the standards. Okay. Okay, so I added a video that you see David Coleman and another woman who helped develop the English Language Arts Standards, kind of talking about all of these things. So that's in Canvas for you to take a look at if you want. But basically, David Coleman, I really like him, and what he said is we've got to do a few essential things differently such that many more students can perform at a college and career-ready level by the time they leave high school. So that's kind of the whole point. So there were several shifts that happened or that the Common Core include, and you're going to see these throughout. So you'll see these throughout the standards. So the first is text complexity and an emphasis on informational text. So we're going to talk about this in more detail next, but when you think about what you're asked to do in college and career, you're asked to really read and comprehend informational texts, and they're quite complex. So what do we need to do to get students ready for that? This second one is probably the one that I see the most threaded throughout the standards. Analyze, infer, give evidence. So we're asking students to read in a way that's reading for comprehension, but also to do something with that reading. They're going to have to make inferences, and when they answer a question or write a paper, they're going to have to provide evidence to support their answers. Writing to sources, so we have to be able to write using different sources and for different audiences. We see an emphasis on more short, focused research projects, so research just as a part of what we do in every class. Mastery of writing and speaking. Don't you love this one as an SLP? It really focusing on effective argument. And if you think about what you have to do to be able to effectively argue a case, you have to take the perspective of your reader, your audience. You have to know your stuff and provide evidence to do that. And so it really emphasizes a lot of what we do. I love this last one too, academic vocabulary. So we really want to focus in on Tier 2 vocabulary. And you'll have a chance to learn about this in this course, but briefly, Tier 2 is from Beck and colleagues, and they suggest there are 3 tiers of vocabulary. Tier 1 is everyday vocabulary that you use in your spoken language, like car, sad, red, those kinds of things. Tier 3, if we jump way up, is discipline-specific vocabulary, like neuron or suffrage or those kinds of words that are going to be defined in a textbook, right? They're going to be those bolded words. That's really the responsibility of that content area teacher. That's the content of those disciplines. Tier 2 vocabulary, this is what I think, should focus on as SLPs. This is the vocabulary that's more complex, more sophisticated, really, than that Tier 1 vocabulary, but you see them across disciplines. So words such as decipher or integrate, those kinds of words you could see in English, you could see in science, you could see in math, you could see in social studies. So that's where you're going to get what they say the most mileage if you focus on those words, and that's particularly important for our English language learners. So let's look at a few of these and what the research does say. Research does tell us that text complexity is an issue, and the ability to answer questions associated with complex text is the chief differentiating factor of students scoring at benchmark compared to those scoring below benchmark on the ACT test. And I mean, logically that makes sense. If you can't comprehend what you're reading, you're not going to be able to do anything with that information. So for us and for our students with language impairment, and I hope you're realizing that that is going to impact speaking, listening, reading, and writing, we have to teach them strategies to attack the text differently so that they can understand it and do something with it. And again, we're going to talk about that a bit later in the course. There's also been a steady decline in the difficulty of text students have been asked to read in schools since 1962, which is kind of crazy. So what you might have noticed already is that a third grade level text prior to the Common Core is now perhaps a second grade level text. And that was really frightening to educators and to SLPs alike, and the people that I've worked with who have adopted the Common Core, because they're like, oh my gosh, but the students who are struggling are having trouble with the current level text. Now we have to give them even harder text. But it makes sense when you think about if the goal is to create college and career ready students, then they have to be ready to read a biology college level textbook when they get out of school. And we have to do that by starting earlier and really giving them the strategies to help themselves deal with complex text. We also know vocabulary is key. So again, differences in vocabulary knowledge is a key differentiating factor in academic achievement. So we have a lot of research that supports that idea. But we also know that in most schools, vocabulary instruction is not frequent enough or systematic. We have research that shows that if you want a student to really understand a word, they have to have been exposed to it over several different times and use it in different ways. There has to be systematic instruction around vocabulary, and that's simply not happening in most places. And then when you think about what students have to do as they're reading a text, they have to grasp sometimes as many as 95% of the words. So if you don't understand a key word in a paragraph, that could really impact your ability to do anything with that text. Also, because, well, this is a key shift, and inference generation is something that's near and dear to my heart, I wanted to talk about that. So we know when we think about inference generation in reading that skilled readers are pretty much automatically generating inferences as they read. So by that I mean they're reading a text and they're pausing and they're saying, oh, I wonder, blah, blah, blah. A lot of the kids with disabilities that we work with have been so focused on decoding and fluency that sometimes they don't even know that they're supposed to be pausing and thinking about the text. But we do know that we can explicitly teach them to do that successfully. We also know that the process of inference generation is similar whether we're talking about when you're reading or in social contexts. What you have to do is combine what you know, so background knowledge, if it's a text about the particular topic. If it's a social situation, what do you know about social situations and people and all of that, and combine it with context. What the words are saying, what is happening with the verbal information my conversational partner is giving me, but also the nonverbal and paralinguistic information. So intonation, prosody, facial expression, all of that. And then you make a guess. And then you keep gathering new information and revise that guess. So we know that skilled conversationalists are just doing it. And think about yourself when you have a conversation and how it's fairly easy. Individuals who struggle with that, this aspect, are definitely having trouble securing and maintaining employment. So here's another quote from David Coleman, "The standards require students to read like a detective and write like an investigative reporter." Now, if we break that up, that means that really just has to do with providing evidence to support your claims. So now we're going to talk about how these standards are organized. There are 4 strands in the English language arts standards, and that includes literacy within history, social studies, science, and technical studies for middle and high school students. We see, and we're focused on English language arts, but know that there's this whole math Common Core state standards too. So these strands are reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. So don't you just love how that's organized? Okay, so important to know that there are these things called anchor standards for reading, anchor standards for writing, for speaking and listening, and for language. Okay, so the anchor standards are what I like to call the more general standards. Grade level standards are aligned with these. By that I mean, in first grade, a child will have a key ideas and details standard number 1, read closely to determine what the text says, blah, 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 but it will be specific for their grade level. Okay, and you'll see grade level standards that align with this anchor standard across every single grade. And the idea is that it allows you to build. If you know what's going on in first grade and you're a second grade teacher, or you're working as an SLP with a second grader, you can say, okay, is there knowledge, skills, or strategies that were taught in first grade that my student is missing, because I'm trying to build on that. So that staircase approach is really helpful. Okay, so we've got these headings, and then we have the numbered items. And so you can take a look at this. All of the English language arts standards are online. If you Google Ccss, you'll find them, and you'll actually need to do that for your paired standards activity that you have to do. So we've got all of these standards. It's just an example for reading. But if we come over here, this is how many of those anchor standards exist in each of these areas. All right, so we've got 10 in reading, 10 in writing, 6 in speaking and listening, and 6 in language. Then we do see some additional standards for K through 5, because we have to teach them to actually decode and be fluent, right? So phonemic awareness, all of that stuff. And then 6 through 12, what I really love is we've got these additional literacy within standards. So we have standards for what does reading, writing, listening, speaking look like in science? What should it look like in social studies? And there are standards around that. What's wonderful about this is it takes this disciplinary literacy perspective, so something you're going to learn in a couple weeks, but it also emphasizes to content area teachers that, yeah, teaching explicit instruction in how to read and write and speak and all of that like a scientist is part of my job. And that's a huge shift that I'm just so happy about. Okay, so there is some lingo involved with the Common Core. Okay, so first, the speaking and listening, anchor standards for speaking and listening. So that's a strand. There are 4 strands: reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language within the English language arts standards. Then we have a domain, and I'm missing the arrow there, but the domain is this heading. There's not a number associated with it, but all of these numbered standards fall under comprehension and collaboration. Okay, so then there's a way they abbreviate it, because you know in education we like to come up with abbreviations and acronyms for everything. So this would be SL for speaking and listening, .CCR, so that's college and career ready. That is synonymous with anchor standards, so it's not grade level specific. Standard 3. So if you're looking at a grade level specific standard, you wouldn't have CCR, you'd have the grade level in there. Okay, so look at this. We've got the anchor standard, and this is really about main ideas. Okay, and then this is what it looks like in 8th grade. So you see reading literature is one grade, or the 6 through 12 reading within kind of standard. Grade 8, number of the standard is 2. So this aligns with the anchor standard too, but it's more specific. We've got things in here about character setting and plot, an objective summary. So it is more specific and provides a little bit more detail about the knowledge, skills, and strategies that a student would need to have to demonstrate this understanding. Okay, so based on the information I told you before, can you pause this and try to figure out what these abbreviations mean? Okay, so let's take a look. This one, RI, is reading information. Grade 8, so the grade always comes first, and then the standard number. We've got writing, college career ready, so that means it's an anchor standard, standard number 6. Speaking and listening, grade 7, standard 1. And language, kindergarten, standard 5. Okay, so this is the last mention of Colorado I will give, but as you see here, there's a link at the bottom, and you can again just Google at CDE, Colorado Academic Standards, to see this. But what we see here is they've got their whole other set of names for these things. But the idea is we've got prepared graduate competencies up here, and you can think of that like the anchor standards. Then we have grade level expectations broken down from preschool to 8th, which is nice. You see what it would look like what kind of evidence you would see if a student had mastered that. They call that the evidence outcomes. And then what are the college career ready skills that are required within each standard. And then we see the same thing at the high school level. So I just want to talk briefly here about reading and how the reading standards are set up a little differently. We're going to use a ladder as a metaphor here. On one vertical side of the ladder, we're going to say that is standard number 1. And here I've got the anchor standard, but it's the same at the grade level. So read closely to determine what the text says explicitly and to make logical inferences from it. All right. Then on the other side, we have the last reading standard, number 10. Read and comprehend complex literary and informational texts independently and proficiently. Then we call the rungs of the ladder standards 2 through 9. And here are just the headings of those, or the domains. So as you're looking at the Common Core State Standards, what they suggest you do is anytime you are working on standards 2 through 9, you also are working on standard 1 and 10, or you should be, okay? Because we want students to always think about using text evidence to answer questions, or in their writing, or in their oral presentations. And we also want to give them complex text. So we have these, the Common Core uses grade level bands for how they determine text complexity. So we have a K through 1 band, so it's not just K, 1, 2, 3. All right. So what are the ELA standards? Here's just another way to look at it. We have K through 5 standards. We have reading and then foundational skills. So that's specific for K through 5. 6 through 12, we have literacy within these areas. But everybody gets reading standards, literature, and informational text, writing, speaking and listening, and language. So I mentioned before that these standards require more than 3 shifts, but we're going to focus on these 3 because these are some big shifts. The shift to more nonfiction, the shift to focusing on grounding everything you do in evidence, and regular practice with complex text and its academic language. So let's look at shift 1, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. So what they suggest is that in K through 5, students experience a balance of nonfiction and fiction. And, some elementaries were already doing a lot of this, so this might not be very surprising. But then in 9 through 12, we want to see that shift to 70% nonfiction and 30% fiction. So I could infer in the middle school grades that we've got a 60-40 balance. Okay, so they even say children learning to read should be given complex text at their grade level, at those grade level bands, even in read aloud, and they should be given nonfiction text. So we also want to consolidate those foundational skills starting in grades 2 with reading comprehension. So as I mentioned before, some of our students with disabilities, the focus is so heavy on sounding good as they're reading. And by that I mean being fluent, decoding accurately, doing all of that. And some of them get stuck on reading for speed, and they're really not focusing on the meaning. But that is ultimately the whole point of reading, is comprehension. So I love that we're encouraging educators to focus on reading comprehension even as students are still learning to read. So we also see that reading aloud texts that are well above grade level should be done throughout K through 5 and beyond. So it's about pushing students and helping them use some of the strategies they have independently to deal with complex text. So why should we care about nonfiction? Well, historically, students haven't been asked to read enough nonfiction in elementary and middle school. And this is not to say that fiction isn't important. It certainly is. And that's why it's not 100% nonfiction, right? But we know that in college and in the workplace, you're going to be asked to read nonfiction. Man, I would just love if my boss asked me to read a novel for work, right? But that is just really not typical. And we also know that informational text is harder for students to comprehend than narrative text. And it's simply because we don't talk like a science textbook or math textbook. But we do, storybooks sound like conversation. And so that's familiar to students. And we need to help students learn how to read different types of informational text, because reading in math looks very different than reading in history. So we want to use content readings across grade levels. We want to build on knowledge. So you might, for example, start off in first grade learning about, my daughter is actually learning about nomads and farmers. Well, we're going to choose readings in second grade that build that knowledge and extend it. Okay, and there are some really nice resources, as I mentioned, on the Common Core website that I really encourage you to take a look at. All right, so this is the grounding everything in evidence, okay? So, most of what we ask you to do in college requires you to base your responses, your work, on some kind of evidence, not just opinions. And we know that on those NAEP tests, the ability to cite evidence differentiates strong from weak student performance. Okay, so we want to focus on that. And we see it throughout the standards. We also know that strong readers have this ability. They're able to locate key information and use that evidence to support their answers on tests and in their writing. So let's take a look at the types of questions that we'll now see on these Common Core state standards tests. So right now, most of these states who have adopted the Common Core are using Smarter Balanced or PARCC tests. And the thing about using those federally funded for development, those tests are important, I think, for states, and people don't realize this, but they are very much aligned with the Common Core. So if we assess, if what we value is what we assess, right, then it is important for these high-stakes tests to align with the standards. And that's what PARCC and Smarter Balance were designed to do. So these questions over here are real questions from state tests before the Common Core. So let's look at this one. This is an elementary example. In Casey at Bat, Casey strikes out. Describe a time when you failed at something. Okay, so do you have to understand the text Casey at Bat to answer this question? No, it is not text dependent. If you're able to write well and you can write about a time when you failed, you would get full credit, right? So we are seeing that there are no longer these types of questions on these state level tests or the PARCC or Smarter Balance. Now we see a question like this: what makes Casey's experiences at Bat humorous? Now a student would have had to read and understand that text to answer this question correctly. All right, here, in a letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King discusses nonviolent protest. Discuss in writing a time when you wanted to fight against something that you felt was unfair. So again, it's not text dependent. Of course, if you read and understood this text, it would help you, but it's not necessary. This one is shorter, but a lot harder. What can you infer from King's letter about the letter he received? Now you're asking them to focus on the text and focus on the language that was used. And that's really the goal here. And then finally, in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln says the nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Why is equality an important value to promote? So a student who understands this idea would be able to answer this question without having read this text. In this one, they say, in this text, according to Lincoln's speech, why is this year, 1776, significant to the events described in the speech? And because they said according to Lincoln's speech, that requires the student to go back to that text. All right, so here's another example of a pre-Common Core question. James Watson used time away from his lab and a set of models similar to preschool toys to help him solve the puzzle of DNA. In an essay, an entire essay, discuss how play and relaxation helps promote clear thinking and problem solving. So, you know, you're having students focus a lot of effort to write an essay on something that is not looking at whether they comprehended this text. And that's a problem because this task had an excerpt that corresponded with it. And so we want to look at, did they understand that or not? Okay, so here are some different questions. By the end of this article, James Watson felt that the answer to everything was in our hands. What was the answer? What problem was he trying to solve? What steps or processes, did he use to discover the answer? That's a lot tougher, and that is certainly text dependent. And this one is my favorite, so go ahead and pause and read this for me. I just think this is a creative task, right? But it's hard to really know what the focus is. Are we asking our students, are we looking at their creativity here? What is the focus? Now this is a text-dependent question. Why does Tom hesitate to allow Ben to paint the fence? How does Twain construct his sentences to reflect that hesitation? Oh boy, that's really an exciting question because you have to understand the language that Mark Twain used. And what effect do Tom's hesitations have on Ben? If you're able to answer those questions, that's evidence that you understood that text. The final shift we're going to talk about is regular practice with complex text and its academic language, okay? So we know that we're not giving students texts that are difficult enough. And 12th grade level texts are much easier, less complex than what students see in college. Okay, we know that less than 50% of graduates can read sufficiently complex texts, and the standards include a staircase of increasing text complexity. So you're building, building, building. We also see them just pointing out general academic vocabulary, tier 2 words explicitly, which for me as an SLP is super exciting. Okay, so that's kind of the foundational information I want you to have about the Common Core. And as we move forward, I want you to be thinking about these very complex standards and how you can focus on cognitive and language underpinnings to address the standards in an aligned way while focusing on language. Right, thanks.